Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Temple Institute Parsha class. I am Gedalia Meyer, podcasting from my home in Ma'ale Adumim. As the world pines for something resembling the old normal, after enduring months of a once-in-a-century pandemic, it finds itself in an even more bizarre scenario. Protests and riots across America and Europe that threaten to spread to much of the rest of the world in an eerie echo of the virus itself have generated perhaps even more turmoil than the biological disease. What many crave right now is stability, and that seems to be a quality that is difficult to find. What is the remedy when everything is out of control? This week's Parsha in Israel is called Shelach, which means send. This simple word refers to the command issued by God to Moshe to send forth men to spy out the land of Canaan in advance of the upcoming invasion. While this command sounded strategic enough when issued, it ultimately resulted in the biggest catastrophe to befall the Israelites since the Golden Calf. This is particularly surprising, since sending out spies was exactly what Joshua would do to great success immediately before the actual invasion, which would take place almost 40 years after the events in our Parsha. What went wrong? To briefly recap the whole story, Moshe, upon receiving this command, selected representatives from each tribe to serve as spies. These men then spent 40 days on their apparently clandestine mission. They investigated both the inhabitants of the land and the conditions of the land itself. Upon return, they gave their report, which began with what appears to be an accurate assessment of what they actually saw. But somewhere in the middle, they switched direction and insisted that the entire project was doomed to failure. The inhabitants of the land were simply too strong to be overcome, they claimed, and the Israelites would ultimately lose the battles. While there were efforts by two of the spies, Joshua and Calev, to counter this claim by inspiring confidence in the Israelite cause due to God's invincible backing, this all fell to deaf ears. For whatever reason, the rank and file populace was taken captive by the pessimism of the majority of spies and raised up the cry that they should all return to Egypt. They wished to either die in Egypt or in the desert rather than allowing God to bring them into this strange land to die by the sword. Things reached a crescendo when they demanded a new leader who would take them back to their old home. They threatened Moshe and Aaron with death. The reaction to all this was quite predictable, at least if one is familiar with the Bible. God told Moshe that the nation was deserving of destruction for their lack of faith. In what is reminiscent of the Golden Calf incident, God says that, quote, "I will kill them with a plague and annihilate them. Then I will make you into a greater, more powerful nation than they." Moshe then intercedes on behalf of the Israelites, like he did following the similar threat with the Golden Calf, and manages to redirect God's anger. But there would be lasting consequences. All those who had witnessed the miracles of the Exodus and subsequent events and still rebelled against God in following the spies would never live to see the land. They would die in the desert as they wished. Everyone over 20 years old would suffer this fate, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. This, of course, was the decree that would result in the fateful wanderings through the desert for close to 40 years. That was the time required to finish off that entire generation, so that a new generation was born and raised who were better equipped to handle the physical and spiritual battles they would encounter in invading and settling the land. It was classic biblical punishment. 40 years of wandering for the 40 days of spying, 1 year for each day. Predictably, this decree raised another outcry among the people. They mourned their fate and even attempted to charge up a mountain to begin the invasion themselves, belatedly admitting their mistake. Moshe told them that this was also doomed to failure. The decree was given and there was no reversing its word. God was no longer with them, no matter how noble their intentions. And so it was. When they ascended this mountain, They were attacked and defeated. Moshe did not even leave his tent to help them. This is the end of the notorious incident of the spies, but it would have eternal repercussions for the Israelites and the Jews. Like the golden calf, this epic disaster would live on in Jewish history as the epitome of national failure. The day the decree was issued is traditionally known to be Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the late summer month of Av. This day has become the historic national day of Jewish mourning, owing to the destruction of both central temples in Jerusalem on this very day, among other catastrophes. In the classic Jewish notion of the cyclical nature of time, Jewish tradition has established that this day had become set in place as the day of disaster. And this incident firmly set in the collective Jewish mind as the epitome of a lost opportunity. It was fate coming upon them with a vengeance. What could account for such an utter mistake? The actual report of the spies, as it is recorded in the Torah, doesn't seem all that bad, at least at the beginning. There are the expected reports of the land and its produce, including the classic description of it, quote, flowing with milk and honey. With the description of the inhabitants, while the description of the inhabitants can be taken as a bit pessimistic, it also seems to be a very realistic assessment of what they should expect. In other words, it was a military intelligence report that was doing exactly what it was supposed to. But then the report deviates a bit from cold facts and ventures into speculation. Quote, the land that we crossed to explore is a land that consumes its inhabitants. All the men we saw there were huge. And then later, we felt like grasshoppers in our own eyes. That is how we were in their eyes. This seems to have been the decisive statement upon which everything turned. Immediately after this, the people raised their outcry against Moshe and the entire divine mission. It was this unwarranted extra bit of pessimism that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. What was the big mistake? It was a lack of confidence. Why did they feel like grasshoppers in their own eyes? How did they determine that that was how they were viewed in their eyes, meaning in the eyes of the inhabitants of the land? Did they ask the inhabitants of the land what they thought of them? This was nothing other than a guess based on a severe case of low self-esteem. Nobody called them grasshoppers except themselves. They brought this harsh critique down upon themselves for no reason other than their own pessimism about their situation. It was a classic case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the time this pessimism had filtered down into the general populace, it was too late to put the genie back into the bottle. Pessimism spread like a virus, infected all who heard it with a fatal dose of its venom. Quote, we wish we had died in Egypt. We should have died in the desert. Why is God bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will be captive. It would be best to go back to Egypt. These words could not have been spoken by people who were still inspired by the events at Mount Sinai. They could not have been uttered by those who vividly remembered the crossing of the sea. They could only have been said by those who had forgotten that past glory and had allowed themselves to be overcome by a mistaken view of the present. In a sense, this spiritual collapse mirrors the human condition. We frequently find ourselves in exactly this situation. We know somewhere in the back of our heads that we've succeeded in the past to some degree or another, but we allow the current situation, whatever it may be, to goad us into depression and pessimism concerning the future. This is by no means a constant condition, but it seems to arise at times of particular stress, and it worms its way into our minds like a cancer. The failure of the spies is the failure of us all. We know that we can overcome challenges, but we convince ourselves that we simply cannot. All too often it is only too late that we realize that we could have done it all along. This state of affairs is so common that it can seem like it is genetically wired into our minds. The story of the spies is like a Shakespearean drama that keeps recurring in our lives, either individually or collectively. While many people manage to successfully avoid it for much of their lives, and an entire society or nation can stave it off for generations, it seems to recur with the regularity of a pandemic. These things seem to just have to happen every once in a while, almost as if we have been infected by some invisible spiritual plague that can only be driven out with radical shifts in our mindset. Lack of confidence and low self-esteem are the symptoms of the plague. The situation can easily build into one of panic and dread. The ultimate result is pessimism, either on an individual or collective level. What is the cure for this disease? While there may not be any genuine cure, it is possible that there is a solution of sorts presented in this parsha. It is to learn to recognize the symptoms when they happen and to fend them off before they take over. Joshua and Calev were pushing the simple idea that they could overcome whatever challenges came their way. They weren't debating the facts, but they were contesting the conclusions that the spies and the people drew from those facts. Quote, "We can do it," was Caleb's simple response to the pessimism. When things were reaching a climax, they both said, "The land through which we passed in our explorations is very, very good. God is with us, so don't be afraid." Sometimes what is necessary to overcome a daunting challenge is simple faith and confidence that the challenge can be overcome. Many of us are experiencing great challenges in our lives right now. It is all too tempting to succumb to the temptation to give up and to believe that all is lost. It is easy to imagine that we'll never recover and that we are doomed to fail. But such sentiments are what convinced the spies that their own mission was hopeless. Perhaps we can take an important lesson from that failure and realize that the simple idea of "we can do it" is what is needed to rise to the occasion. No matter how much things seem otherwise, God is still with us in some way. Shabbat Shalom.